Hi, everyone. The title of this session is Supporting Students with Dyslexia in Late Elementary Grades and Beyond. So today I'll be talking about some strategies and some supports for students as they encounter increasingly more difficult reading content as they progress and advance through grade levels. So my name is Nathan Clemmens. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Special Education at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm also part of the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk. My main areas of research include reading development, reading assessment, and reading interventions for students with reading difficulties. I'm particularly interested in word level reading difficulties, i.e. dyslexia in young children, and I also do some work with reading comprehension for adolescents. So our focus for today is on students in late elementary grades and beyond. So by that, I mean students in 4th and 5th grade who are nearing the end of elementary school, but this content will also apply to students in middle school and in high school, especially as kids are encountering more difficult words and more difficult texts in later grade levels. But some of the content should still be applicable to students in grade levels before that too. But our focus primarily is on students who are encountering more and more difficult texts and more difficult words and ways to support them. I'm bringing the definition of dyslexia in here, but I know it's familiar to most viewers, but I do want to point out a couple things with this. In blue is the core deficit associated with dyslexia, right? Difficulties in accurate or fluent word recognition and poor spelling and decoding abilities. Those are the core features, and those are still core features for older students with dyslexia as well. But in red is something particularly relevant for older students, and that's the secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So for older students with word level reading difficulties with dyslexia, the lack of reading experience in many cases that they've had in preceding years, this is starting to build up potentially in affecting their vocabulary knowledge or background knowledge that may be an issue because of lack of reading experience in contrast to peers. And so you'll see that a lot of the content in the session today is focused on these two areas, on still supporting their word recognition skills and also bolstering their language comprehension, their vocabulary and background knowledge that supports their comprehension of text. Our theoretical lens for this session is the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading is the result of work by Phil Goh and Bill Tunmer in the 1980s. But this is a conceptualization that views reading comprehension as the product of decoding or word level skills, the ability to read words accurately and efficiently, and language comprehension. So your knowledge of the language system, vocabulary, your ability to understand spoken language. And the idea here is that as soon as printed matter is decoded, the reader applies exactly the same mechanisms that they would apply to a spoken equivalent. They're reading the words on the page. After that point, they're applying the same language comprehension and knowledge base to understanding what they read. And these two core competencies underlie reading comprehension, but more importantly, the simple view conceptualizes the two domains in which reading difficulties tend to occur most often. Certainly for students with dyslexia, we're talking about decoding difficulties as a core issue. But also there's some language comprehension we have to attend to as well in effectively supporting them over time. So the three areas in which I want to focus, where I think the three domains in which it's important to attend for older students with dyslexia are in these three areas. So direct instruction in reading complex words and doing that on an ongoing basis, active reading practice, and also strategies and supports for language and knowledge building. So vocabulary knowledge, talking about text, some strategies for reading comprehension as well. So the first is around teaching students some flexible strategies for reading complex words. So as they're getting into later grade levels, even mid and later elementary school, they're encountering increasingly longer words, more complex words with different spelling patterns that they're unfamiliar with, compound words, words with prefixes and suffixes. And so it's important to give them strategies for attacking those complex words and versatile strategies they can use flexibly. Now, by and large, you want to continue to prompt sounding out as students' primary go-to word attack strategy. Sounding out words just like they learned with at the beginning stages of reading, that's still going to be their most reliable go-to approach and first step and first attack strategy they should take with unknown words. If it's not successful with all words, it will help them get close in many cases to the correct pronunciation. Now, in times when sounding out isn't successful, we can back that up with a set of strategies that I'll talk to you about here, including analogy or rhyme-based strategies, syllable-based strategies, and morpheme-based strategies. And we can think about these as providing kids with a toolbox, a set of tools that they can use flexibly when sounding out isn't successful. So reading by analogy, you can kind of think about this as reading by rhyme, and this is similar to word families instruction in earlier grades. In early grades, kids learned to read cat, and they read mat, sat, rat, and so on, and learned that they can associate and recognize that rhyme pattern in the word as part of a word recognition strategy. And then it's just using the initial sounds to determine what that unique pronunciation was for each word. We can do a similar thing now with longer words. For example, longer spelling patterns like ATCH, for example, and all the words that have that spelling pattern in them that students might encounter in later grade levels. And so we can provide instruction in this way, where if you can read catch, then you can read match, patch, thatch, scratch, and so on. And when encountered in text, when sounding out of a word is not successful, we can prompt students to look at that rhyme unit for similarly spelled words. For example, if they come across the word regard in text and they struggle with it for a minute, you can point out, well, you can read card, you can read this portion, so you can probably read regard, and pointing out that rhyme portion as familiar letter pattern that they might be already familiar with. Oh, I want to point out before we move on that an excellent resource is here at the bottom of this slide. Kearns and Wally in 2019, their article, Helping Students with Dyslexia Read Long Words Using Syllables and Morphemes, that appeared in Teaching Exceptional Children. So some content here in this section is coming from there, and it's a really excellent resource, so I do highly recommend that. Okay, so that's analogy, reading by analogy. It's one strategy we can put in their toolbox to add to their sounding out skills. The second are syllable-based strategies. So with syllable-based strategies here, first, students should be able to verbally segment a word by syllables. They should be able to hear a word and segment it, clap it out basically by its syllables, because this is the foundation for teaching strategies to read longer words. Syllable-based strategies rely on this idea that students can be taught that syllables almost always have a vowel letter in them, and syllables can be read like individual words. And so looking at a multi-syllabic word, really, we can break this apart into smaller segments, almost like smaller words. Students can read those individual syllables, pronounce each one, and then put them all back together to read that word, almost very similarly to how that they would sound out a shorter word when they were learning to read. Okay, reading the sounds like C-A-T and cat, putting those sounds together as a whole word. Here they're breaking apart a longer word like important or insufficient or intersection, and breaking it apart by syllables, putting it back together to read it as a whole unit. First, in teaching syllable-based strategies, ensuring that students know all the vowels, short and long sounds, sounds for Y. They should also be able to read vowel combinations. If not, if some of those are missing, teach those as you're teaching these types of strategies. There are a number of common and useful syllables that are important to teach. You can teach these almost the same way as you taught students to read words in beginning reading. You can teach these across a variety of sessions and provide students with advantages then when they encounter those longer words, breaking them apart, reading those individual parts, and then putting them back together. The every syllable has at least one vowel is a great way to operationalize a syllable-based reading strategy. This is Randy O'Connor, result of her work. So first, when they encounter a word like significant, students underline all the vowels in the long word. Okay, they join any vowel teams into one vowel sound. The significant doesn't have any in this example, but they might be seeing vowel combinations like EA, OI, and so on, and joining those together into one sound. They then identify the known word parts. For example, if kids can read sig or can't, okay, you can kind of identify those as sections they can read. They count the number of word parts or syllables in this case, would be 5. That's what they're looking for when they go back to put them together. Break those words into part for decoding, sig, nif, can't, and try pronunciation, putting those pieces back together. The teacher should be there to provide immediate feedback, both either affirmative feedback if the student is correct or corrective feedback as needed based on the student's pronunciation. Teach these with a direct instruction approach, modeling, doing it together, having the student practice that I do, we do, you do sequence, and reviewing frequently. And also, as students are learning to read syllables, prompt students to start with a short vowel sound first. If they're unfamiliar with a particular syllable and how to read it, use the short vowel sound first because that's more common. And then they can try the long vowel sound if that wasn't successful. The second are morpheme-based strategies. So morpheme-based strategies are very similar to syllable-based strategies, but morphemes are a little bit different. So morphemes are units of speech that hold meaning. So these can include prefixes, these can include roots, and these can also include suffixes. Many longer words that kids encounter in later grade levels will contain morphemes. Many of the multi-syllabic compound words will have morphemes in them. And learning morpheme-based strategies can help students attack those longer words that they encounter. And you can teach these in the same way as you teach syllable-based strategies or teaching shorter words. You're teaching students to read morphemes, and that puts them at an advantage for being able to decode longer words as they encounter them. For example, here's an instance of or an illustration of the importance of morphemes in reading longer words. So the morpheme enter and the morpheme shun, I-O-N, which sounds like shun when it follows T and S. But look at the different words we can make, the complex words we can make with these particular morphemes. So interact or interaction, intersect, intersection, and so on. Words that the kids are very likely to encounter as they increase in grade levels. So the most common morphemes here are listed. These appear often in text and in longer words. Again, teaching these prefixes, these suffixes, these roots as single words, and then as students are encountering those and being able to break them apart, reading those individual pieces or parts as words and then putting them back together, puts them in a position for reading those longer words and gives them one of those flexible strategies that they can apply. The peeling off strategy for reading longer words with prefixes and suffixes is related to morpheme-based approaches. So this strategy, you first make it possible by first teaching those common prefixes and suffixes like I'm listing here. But here, students learn to underline or circle the prefixes or suffixes and basically peel them off, and thereby isolating the root word. Okay, reading that root word, and then reading each part, reading the prefix, reading the root, reading the suffix if there is one, and putting them all back together to read the word as a whole unit. Okay, so similar to other approaches, but another way of operationalizing it. It's best, as you're teaching this, to start off with words that only have just a prefix or just a suffix. As they're successful with it, then you can move up to words that have both. The best strategy is another approach at this. This is another of Randy O'Connor's methods. Here in the best strategy, the acronym stands for break it apart, examine the base word, say each part, and try the whole word. Okay, so it's another variation on this theme where kids are breaking apart based on sections, on syllables, on morphemes, on parts that they know and recognize, and then putting it all back together. You can see workable, you can break apart into workable. A lot of kids will know work, that word, right? Misdirected, a lot of kids will be able to pronounce MIS as miss. They might recognize direct, okay, and so on. So they're breaking this apart into smaller pieces, recognizing pieces they know, and putting things back together. So as students are using this, and so the important thing is you're giving these, you're teaching these types of strategies, you're giving them to them as part of a toolbox, a toolkit, and teaching them and prompting them to use them flexibly as they encounter words that are unfamiliar to them. As they make attempts at pronouncing a whole word, you starting with sounding out and then trying analogy, trying peeling off. Sometimes they might be getting close or not quite right. Sometimes when they hear themselves pronounce a word incorrectly, they might be able to recognize what that correct pronunciation can be because they're getting close enough. But if they don't self-correct, provide that immediate feedback, give them correct pronunciation, and have students try reading that word again. Okay. Also making sure that your affirmative feedback is there as well. As students read a word correctly, and especially if they seem tentative in reading it, making sure that you're telling them, great job, excellent. You're giving them feedback that attempt was correct. That's really important, both affirmative and corrective feedback for struggling readers. Another thing that scholars have pointed out is to avoid adding to students' anxiety by referring to the irregularity of English. Yes, English is irregular. It's considered an opaque orthography. There's not a one-to-one correspondence between letters and sounds. But it is more consistent than a lot of people tend to assume. And talking about irregularity of English doesn't help for students who have reading difficulties. That can add to anxiety and add to frustration. Making them think it's unpredictable doesn't really help matters in helping them be successful readers. Instead, we should be talking to students that English can be very predictable, because it is. There are 16 letters in the alphabet that almost always make the same sound. A lot of letter combinations only make one or two sounds. And so reinforcing that for students is helpful. It helps ease anxiety. It teaches them that things are predictable and that they can trust the code. They should be able to rely on the letters and the letter combinations within words and using that to sound out. Okay, again, falling back on sounding out as the go-to strategy when they encounter an unknown word. Of course, it's not going to work every time, but it'll work very often. Many times it'll get them in the ballpark so that they can self-correct in some cases. And when that isn't successful, now you're teaching them those backup strategies to use if sounding out doesn't get them there. So analogy, syllable reading, peeling off, the best strategy, and so on. Also making sure you're not prompting students to skip words. You're not prompting them to guess at words based on illustrations or figures. You're not asking them to guess at a word based on what they think the sentence is about or the word's shape. Doing those kinds of things, referring to illustrations, referring to context is frequently unhelpful. It's mentally taxing for students, it's distracting, and results in bad habits. Focus on the code. Teach them to trust the code and give them strategies for using it in reading those words independently. Let's talk a little bit about how we really come to know a word and how that becomes automatic for us. So Perfetti's lexical quality hypothesis is relevant here, because what this says is that a word is well represented in our memory when we have three strong representations of it. We have an orthographic representation, that's how the word is spelled. We have a strong phonological representation, we know how the word is pronounced. And we have a semantic representation, we know what the word means. So the word cat is spelled C-A-T, that's its orthographic representation. It has a pronunciation of cat, and it refers to an animal. So when there are strong, high-quality connections between all three representations, it facilitates being able to recognize that word almost instantaneously when encountered in print, in text, and recognizing what it means. It helps it become part of how we process text almost instantaneously and efficiently. And the implications of this is that we should be continuing to integrate spelling and vocabulary instruction within word reading instruction. So as students, even older students, as they go through grade levels, this is still important. As they're learning to read those longer, more complex words, have them practice spelling them. Always be talking about what those words mean, okay? Talking about, and first before I get to the meaning, that spelling practice should align with the decoding and word reading instruction that they're doing. They're spelling the words that they're practicing reading in the intervention. And then talking about word meanings as much as possible, using them in a sentence, especially as students decode words for the first time. You're referring to what those words mean. You might use them in a sentence. And this adds information for them. And in many cases, students may have encountered this word before. They may have heard it in conversation. They may have an idea of what it means. They've just never read it in print. And so calling attention to that meaning helps solidify potentially the connection between the spelling of that word and its pronunciation. You're basically adding to this triangle model here for them and strengthening their memory for words that they're reading. So in summary, before we go on to the next section, you're teaching students, as students are getting into later grade levels, you're continuing to focus on word level skills, and especially targeting skills that they're going to need as they encounter increasingly more complex and more difficult and challenging words. You're continuing to focus on sounding out as their go-to primary strategy, but you're also giving them other strategies for their toolkit and teaching them how to flexibly apply them in situations where they can determine how a word is pronounced independently. You're always providing affirmative feedback and error correction throughout instruction, providing lots of review. And you also remember the importance of vocabulary. As students are reading those words, as they're decoding them, you're referring to what they're meaning, to what those words mean, helping to solidify the connections between the spelling of the word and its pronunciation in memory. Okay, and here's one example I should have brought in earlier, but as students read the word patch, you can say, yeah, like patch that covers a hole in a shirt or a patch of flowers in the field, okay? Doesn't always have to be a precise definition. Sometimes just using it in a sentence in context is enough to demonstrate how that word is used and what it means. Okay, so the next section is active reading practice and the importance of reading every day, especially for students with reading difficulties. So reading practice, of course, is critical and important for everybody. For all individuals, becoming a successful reader depends on sufficient exposure to text over time. This is what helps foster reading fluency. But for students with dyslexia, especially as they get into later grade levels, continuing to provide reading practice each day is key for several reasons. As I mentioned, becoming a proficient reader depends on reading a lot. We need a lot of exposures to words to add those to memory. For typically developing readers, estimates are roughly in the range of 4 to 5 exposures with feedback. For individuals with dyslexia or reading difficulties, sometimes it's many more than that, maybe even double the number of exposures needed to add those words to memory. And the implications of this is that as typically developing readers are learning to read, they're becoming successful readers, they're starting to read more. They're enjoying it because they're successful at reading. They're gaining access to more content, more reading material, and they're starting to learn more. They're getting more background knowledge, they're starting to acquire new vocabulary, new words they hadn't seen before, and this feeds back on their reading skills, okay? They're becoming better readers as they're reading more. They're enjoying it. And you can see what happens then in the implications for individuals who struggle to learn to read. Reading is more difficult, it's challenging, frustrating, and embarrassing. They don't read as much. Over time, they may not be acquiring the same level of background knowledge and vocabulary that feeds back into their reading skills. And so you have this cyclical relationship that for typically developing readers helps them become more proficient, and for struggling readers continues to pose challenges for them in becoming a proficient reader. This ties into reading fluency. I like to refer to reading efficiency rather than fluency because really fluent reading is about reading very efficiently. It requires little conscious effort. Your cognitive processes are engaging in very efficient ways when you're reading fluently. Reading fluency is driven by word reading and language, and it's made possible by lots of reading. And exposure to text is what's facilitating the ability to read words automatically. And reading text is feeding into their comprehension, which feeds back into reading text accurately and quickly. It's another cyclical relationship. And so exposure to reading, providing lots of reading practice, giving them more opportunities to add those words to memory, and building knowledge along the way, you're enhancing reading skills, reading fluency over time. So what should reading practice look like? So for students reading difficulties, most often they should be reading out loud. And reading out loud in a reading practice situation is beneficial for several reasons. One of those is that at first it allows their reading to be monitored by a teacher or a skilled reader. They're there to provide feedback and error correction, affirmative feedback when they're reading words correctly, and immediately correcting errors when they're making them. Second, there's some evidence that verbal articulation of words might increase the chance that they're read correctly in the future. That verbal articulation might strengthen that connection in memory potentially. It also might facilitate self-monitoring and better facilitate self-detection and correction of errors than reading silently. And this is similar to if you've ever presented orally, you've done a speech, you've done a presentation somewhere. There's always a difference between reading your presentation to yourself silently and then saying it out loud. As you say it out loud, as you hear yourself say it, you're always going to find trouble spots, errors, places where things just didn't flow as smoothly. And I think that might play into this in terms of reading aloud for students. They're more likely to hear when they might make errors. They might maybe potentially better able to correct errors as they're hearing themselves read, as opposed to reading silently where they might skip over or gloss over those words really quickly. So how to engage in reading practice aloud? That could be individual reading with a student, it could be choral reading with groups of students, having students take turns reading aloud. Partner reading activities are great where students are reading with a peer. Those paired activities are really useful in maximizing the amount of oral reading that students do in the classroom. The text that's provided to students for reading practice, this is also an important consideration. As students are practicing reading, okay, not necessarily for instruction when you're teaching word level skills and using text for that. These are the times when you want to practice building fluency, providing reading practice on a daily basis. And these texts should be those in which students are highly accurate, okay? And also, you should think about the text difficulty relative to the amount of support you can provide to students. So if the goal is for students to be reading independently, or perhaps reading with pairs, partner reading activities, look for texts in which students are at least 95% accurate. 95% translates to one error out of every 20 words. On the other hand, if you are present as the teacher or as the interventionist, and you're there to correct errors and prompt decoding strategies, then the text can be a little bit more difficult, okay? You'll be there to correct errors, and so your support helps mitigate issues related to more difficult text. So there you can use text perhaps it's around 90%, where they're making 90% accuracy, making one word or one error out of every 10 words. So the question often comes up is when to use, or whether we should use silent reading practice for older students. Silent reading practice is great, is excellent when students can read accurately and fluently. Silent reading is natural. You know, rarely do we read orally. We do most of our reading as skilled readers. We do most of it silently. But the problem for students with reading difficulties is that, you know, it's illustrated really well by this Seidenberg quote, is that children who struggle reading text aloud do not become good readers if left to read silently. Their dysfluency merely becomes inaudible. So reading silently, you know, their errors are undetectable. We're not there to correct and mitigate or address any bad habits they might be demonstrating as they're reading silently. So if silent reading practice, again, is something that you want to use, and I do encourage you to use it, especially as kids get older. Silent reading practice can be effective as long as they're accurate in the text that you're giving them for practice. Okay, look for texts in which they're at least 95% accurate. Their fluency is decent, and they have comprehension skills that allow them to recognize when they make errors and allows them to fix up those errors when they occur. Okay, so other things you can do is pre-teach difficult or unfamiliar words. Look at a text, try to anticipate what words are going to be difficult. You can do some pre-teaching before students go to read. And you can also have them highlight or circle words they encounter as they're reading. Then they can go back and ask questions. You can provide some support after they've read. Okay, so let's move on to some reading comprehension strategies and supports. There's a set here that I'll talk about in detail. Most here are aimed at building students' knowledge in vocabulary and background knowledge and providing more, more information or more content exposure in those areas. So let's get into it. So one question that comes up is whether or not we should be teaching reading comprehension strategies. By strategies, we're referring to things like main idea identification, prediction, using story maps or graphic organizers, doing retelling. The short answer is yes, we should still be teaching reading comprehension strategies because several of those are useful for students with reading difficulties. However, teaching of reading comprehension strategies should not take the place or not take away from any necessary word level instruction that students with dyslexia need, or instruction that helps build their vocabulary and background knowledge. As we'll talk about in a moment, vocabulary and background knowledge may be the most essential, most important aspects for reading comprehension. When you do teach reading comprehension strategies, use them judiciously. Avoid those that take unnecessary time. For example, I'm not a big fan of KWL charts. That's the what do you know, what do you want to know, what did you learn after reading, because they spend too much time before reading on things that the text may not even be about. Okay, so we'll talk about some things that I think are more relevant and better suited for that time. Keep in mind the simple view of reading. Okay, again, this is reading comprehension is the product of decoding and language comprehension. In that language comprehension domain, vocabulary and knowledge are critical. Vocabulary knowledge is an essential part of understanding language. That if you learn a new language, so much of that is dependent on understanding what words mean. Okay, the same applies to reading comprehension. And we can view knowledge and background knowledge as a part of language comprehension, understanding what people are talking about. Okay, so two critical interrelated areas of knowledge for reading comprehension that are essential. The first is word knowledge or vocabulary, understanding what words mean, the meanings of words, okay? And world knowledge or background knowledge, understanding concepts and how, ideas and thoughts and events, experiences and so on. These two are interrelated. I have a Venn diagram because sometimes it's very difficult to separate vocabulary from background knowledge, because having background knowledge, so to speak, on a topic often involves understanding the vocabulary of that domain, understanding something like an ecosystem or photosynthesis or nuclear fission requires understanding the vocabulary of that domain, of that topic area. Now, there's still going to be some things around concepts and ideas and putting those things together that is part of that background knowledge part. But really, there's a big intersection between the two. And for teachers, I think this is a good thing, because vocabulary in that content domain provides a good basis for teaching the background knowledge of a topic. So teachers can use interventionists as students are progressing through grade levels, especially for students with dyslexia, using text and media to continue to build knowledge and vocabulary. Media might be video, might be audio, might be images, but use that media to build that content knowledge, that vocabulary before they read. Develop those key concepts before they get into reading. Growing up, we always, going through science and social studies, we'd go through a unit, go through text, and then at the end, we'd watch a movie or a film strip about it. It's almost like we should reverse that for students reading difficulties, right? Build the content knowledge first so they understand better as they encounter this information in text. Also do some work to select text that will help expand their background knowledge, expose them to new vocabulary. During reading, you're there to help them support integrating that new knowledge, expanding new knowledge in the content that they're reading, and providing key prompts that are linking the content they learned initially with what they've read in the passage. We can also do some direct instruction in vocabulary, and Isabel Beck and her colleagues have a great system for teaching new vocabulary terms. They recommend selecting words that are going to be very important for upcoming texts that students are going to encounter. They focus a lot on what they refer to as tier 2 or academic words. These are words that are not very common in everyday language, but are very common in academic texts and in academic situations, and thus very important for reading comprehension. And so those words might be present in students' curriculum glossaries, in unit previews. If you look through the text beforehand, you know what vocabulary are going to be key for understanding that unit. Also, there's publications that have looked at the most common and most important academic words. Academic words, again, are what's really common to academic situations, but less common in everyday language. These particular words where typically developing readers are encountering a lot of as they read. For students with reading difficulties, they're not seeing a lot of those academic words because they occur most often in text. And the cruel irony is that those academic words are really important for success in school and beyond in text-based types of situations. Okay, so the recommendations are to teach 8 to 10 new words per week. Introduce words with a brief student-friendly definition. A student-friendly definition is a definition of a word that is brief and simple, but still captures what's important about that word. But then, instead of focusing solely on reciting definitions, it are more activities to work on students' use of those words. Discussions activities where they use a word or they evaluate its use, not just reciting its definition. They should still know what it means, but they should be able to do things and engage in activities like evaluating whether or not a word is used correctly in a sentence and have them explain why or why not. Have them associate new words they're learning with prior experiences that they've had or existing knowledge. Identify synonyms and antonyms of that new word and create their own sentences of the word, because this is really how we use vocabulary on a daily basis. Rarely are we asked to define a word. And sometimes, you ask someone to define a word and they have to think about it for a moment. But if they see that word in print or they hear that word in conversation, they know immediately what it means and how it's used. Okay, so focusing on instruction of vocabulary with a brief definition, but emphasizing more on how we actually use that word in daily life or in reading. Another support for students in building knowledge and reading comprehension is using discussions, enhancing critical thinking about text, doing this more so in informational text, not just in narrative text. A lot of times as kids go through secondary grade levels in English and language arts, you see a lot of heavy text-based discussion about stories, about narratives, about poetry. You don't see that type of in-depth discussion about informational or expository text. And I think that's something that might be missing. And it's something that Element and Compton have recommended, is that same level of close reading, of annotating text, helping students identify claims and evaluate evidence in the informational text that they're reading. This might be key for helping them understand, especially the content area informational text in science and history and social studies that they're encountering in later grade levels. A great example is a recent study by Elizabeth Swanson and colleagues who incorporated a lot of these strategies into this intervention. This was aimed at helping students understand social studies texts. And what they did here was first teach relevant background knowledge essential for the upcoming text. They used illustrations, so here they use media to help support developing background knowledge, taught highly relevant social studies vocabulary, utilized text-based discussions during reading and asking questions about the text. They taught them to identify main idea or get the gist. After reading, they reviewed and connected the target vocabulary they taught and discussed how it was used in those passages. And then they wrote about the text using the gist summaries that they generated. So a great way of kind of pulling together a lot of these things that we're talking about here. Another strategy, another comprehension strategy that is recommended is using graphic organizers specifically about teaching text structure, and especially for expository text. So text structure refers to how a text is organized, and different types of text are organized in different ways. We can think about text structure, it probably makes the most sense to think about a narrative text structure, what we see in fiction and stories. Those texts are typically structured where we have an introduction of the characters and setting that leads to the conflict. There's a description of rising and falling action, and then followed by some resolution of that conflict. So narrative texts are often set up that way, and kids are often more familiar naturally with narrative text structure because they're more familiar with hearing stories. They're less familiar, however, with text structures that occur in expository and informational reading content. So this is what they're encountering in science and social studies and in history. And so there's several different types of text structures that occur there. There's sequence of events, there's description, compare and contrast, cause and effect, and so on. The key here about text structure is that knowledge of those text structures, more familiarity of them, helps provide almost a preview. It helps provide more comfort and eases students' comprehension of those different types of texts. It provides sort of a schema or mental framework for understanding. It's similar to how you as a driver are familiar with a road. You understand where the twists and turns are coming up, where you need to slow down, and where you need to, where you can go a little bit faster. Knowledge and familiarity of a road is similar in this way to knowledge and familiarity of text structure in understanding what might be coming up in particular types of text, so knowing what to expect. So I mentioned that focusing more on expository text structures because kids will already be more familiar with narrative structures, and graphic organizers are a great way to teach text structures in expository text. There's different organizers here for different types. And there's also recommendations that teach signal words. Different text types will have words that signal that this is the type of text that they're in. So for example, a sequence type of text will have words like first, second, third, finally, after, and so on. Cause and effect text will have if then, reasons why, as a result, therefore. So certain signal words that help clue students into what type of text that they are reading. And lastly, continue to work on improving students' inference making when reading. So inferences are, really when we refer to inference making, we're reading between the lines, right? We're understanding what the author means when the author doesn't explicitly say that. And inference making is critical because authors rarely state every detail. You know, there's always some level of inference that we're going to have to make as we have strong reading comprehension when we're reading. Students, even students with reading difficulties, tend to, you know, they make inferences all the time in everyday language, but tend to struggle a lot when trying to make inferences in text. So we can teach and support inference making, things like pronoun reference. So making sure that students understand who a pronoun refers to, who or what a pronoun refers to in a text. We conduct work with adolescents and students in middle school, and we're always surprised about how often students struggle with pronoun references and understanding who a pronoun refers to in a sentence or in a text. Things like understanding connectives. So words like however, nevertheless, but, furthermore. Those words convey meaning, and you can understand how a word like furthermore conveys meaning about what's happening in that next section of the sentence, as opposed to another type of word. Okay, and helping students understand those kinds of words and what they mean for inferential comprehension. Helping students connect portions of text to make inferences, helping them use knowledge, their prior knowledge to make inferences. Here in this example, this is an intervention we've developed where students are looking at what the text says, they're thinking about what they know, and they're thinking about what inference they can make based on those two pieces of information. There's also times we can teach them strategies for inferring word meaning from text. So encountering an unknown word, helping them understand what that word might mean based on the context and the surrounding information, helping them make an inference in that regard. Okay, so to wrap up, 3 areas of focus I think are critical of continued emphasis for students with dyslexia as they go through later grade levels. Continuing and not neglecting the direct instruction in reading words. Again, reading words, that core area of deficit for students with dyslexia, and as they increasingly encounter more longer and difficult words, we need to provide them with strategies for reading those difficult words independently. Always and continue to provide active reading practice. That's what kids need to keep adding words to memory, to build reading fluency, build comfort and proficiency. And then addressing reading comprehension skills, particularly focused on building language and knowledge building. Vocabulary is a key aspect. Things like talking about text, making inferences, and using some select strategies. So thanks for watching. Again, I'm Nathan Clemmens from UT Austin. Please let me know if you have any questions or if you'd like more information. My email is nathan.clemmens@austin.utexas.edu. You can also follow me on Twitter. My handle is Dr. Nathan Clemmens, and there I post updates from our research team as well as that of our colleagues. So again, thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful, and have a great day.